All right, great. Well, thank you all for joining us for special education. We are talking tonight about the report card and preparing for a parent-teacher conference. I'm Caitlin McAndrews. I am one of the attorneys at McAndrews, Mehalick, Connolly, Hulse and Ryan. I mostly practice in Delaware, but we're going to be talking about concepts that are relevant everywhere. And then I'm joined tonight by Kim. Kim, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining in. We are excited to talk and have a conversation about report card conferences and parent-teacher conferences, or report cards and parent-teacher conferences, something that is happening in most of the districts that we represent. I, too, am an attorney with the firm, working exclusively in the area of special education and predominantly in Pennsylvania in the southeastern part of the state. So we are going to move on. And again, we thank you all for joining us. And of course, the technology is my foe. I'm trying to move this slide. Let's see.
If you click it too, it might be able to move forward. If you just click the slide, yeah.
Ah, there we go. That was
Excellent.
Allie in the background, the magic genie. So we always like people who take time out of their day to join us to frame what our objectives are. And our objectives this evening are to provide you with information as a parent and caregiver of a school-age student, with information that you can use when you are preparing for a conference or in looking at and really understanding your child's report card. Report cards are something that every child gets, even a child with an IEP. And what Katie and I have found is that parents can really use a report card as one piece of a puzzle in terms of how their child is doing. There are other pieces as well, but the report card is something that that you can definitely look upon and hopefully use as guidance.
In terms of specific objectives that we hope you leave tonight's webinar understanding and being able to implement, we are going to help you to recognize the importance and value of report card and teacher conferences. And we're going to talk about some of the things that you can get out of them that maybe you weren't looking for before. We hope that you'll be able to identify key pieces of information to gather from report cards. And we're going to talk about some of the things that we focus on as education attorneys, and also in our experience as parents. We will help you to know how to prepare questions for your next parent-teacher conference so that you go in with an understanding of what you want to get out of it. They're often very brief, and so we want you to be well prepared to get answers to the questions that you are looking to understand. And finally, we will help you to determine next steps for after report cards and conferences. Once you have that information, what you might want to do with it.
So report cards. If you are tuning in and your child has an IEP, we understand that as part of that IEP, individual educational plan, you are going to be getting regular progress monitoring on how your student, how your child is doing with respect to his or her individualized IEP goals. A report card, on the other hand, is the official school district or charter statement around how your child is doing in particular core subjects. Now, that is important because every child in the state of Pennsylvania and in the state of Delaware is being provided with a curriculum. That's necessary. And that curriculum is divided up in the ways that you see on a report card. I always do it the old-fashioned way: reading, writing, and arithmetic. There are, of course, other subjects as well, social studies, science. You want to know how your child is doing in those subjects. oftentimes what Katie and I find is there can be a disconnect. There's a disconnect between what the IEP progress monitoring is telling a parent and then holding up the report card, what the report card is saying, in terms of how the child is doing in that curriculum, general education world. So hopefully they are meshed and there's consistency between the two, but there may not be. And that's something we're going to talk about this evening. We also will be talking about, interestingly enough, the differences between an elementary level report card. Think about like pre-K to perhaps 4th grade, middle school, 5th to 8th grade, and then high school report cards, grades 9 through 12.
I'm actually going to begin by addressing some of what you may see on an elementary report card. And for me, as a parent of elementary school students, it's been interesting because I didn't look at my own elementary report card enough, or if I did, I wasn't internalizing it. And so one thing that surprised me when I first started looking at them is that you're not getting 1 grade per class. So if we're thinking reading, writing, arithmetic, and then some of the other classes that Kim was pointing out, social studies, science, specials classes, you're not going to typically see on an elementary report card 95 in English language arts, 85 in math. You're going to see each of those subject areas broken down into different skills that the school and the state expect to see students developing over the course of the year. And knowing that they are skills that should be developed over the course of the year is important because your child is expected to be introduced to them, to begin to practice and master them, and then to have those skills mastered by the end of the school year so they can go on to learning different skills. So on the one hand, it may not be cause for concern if your student is just learning some of those skills at this point. If their grades, which are not going to be A, B, C, D, they're typically going to be something more like they've been introduced to the skill, they're beginning to learn the skill, they're practicing the skill or developing. You'll sometimes see like D for developing. And then finally, when they've mastered it, that'll be indicated. So it may not be cause for concern if they're merely being introduced to the skill or getting their initial exposure. But you do want to make sure that as you're moving through the school year, you're seeing them moving toward mastery on those skills in all areas, because the skills that are listed there for a reason, and that's because they're expected to be mastered by the end of that school year. Sometimes elementary report cards will have a reading level. Even when it's on there, it is often hard for a layperson to understand. So you want to look in the English language arts section or reading section. You might also see it in part of the heading on the report card, or it may be reported at the same time as the report card, but in a different document. The district that my kids attend, we typically get reading testing in a different document. But it's something to watch out for. And if you don't see it, that is absolutely a question to add to your list of parent-teacher conference questions. Reading is so important, and especially in the early elementary years, we really want to see kids learning those skills of sounding out words and then moving to becoming more fluent readers by the middle elementary grades. And so it's a really good question to ask your teachers to make sure that you're following up as a parent. And if they're not developing those reading skills at an appropriate pace, there are some next actions that you can take, and we'll talk about those as well. And then finally, another thing that you may see, and you likely will see on an elementary report card, is more social and emotional learning indicators. These are less common on secondary report cards, on middle school and upper and high school report cards, but they're much more common at this age as we are expecting students to be learning the skills of being students. They are learning what it means to go to school and to be a student and learning how to learn. And so those social emotional markers will also be on the report card, and they're important to pay attention to.
I just want to underscore the reading. I'm a big advocate for reading and literacy, as is everyone in the firm. It's foundational, it's critical, it is a gateway to every other skill, even math. And what I would appreciate all of you who are tuning in taking away is something that was taught to me when I was an employee of a large school district, and that is the grades K to 3 are typically where children are taught to read. They are learning to read. And that goes along with what Katie pointed out. Those foundational skills are listed for a reason, because those are the bedrock foundational skills of learning to read. K to 3, learning to read. After grade 3, so grades 4 and beyond, there is an expectation that a child is reading. And now the phrase changes from learning to read versus reading to learn. And so if you think about that, there's a big difference. And the expectations on kids with respect to reading changes drastically as of 4th grade. So K to 3 report cards find that reading level for sure, for sure. That's just my plug on early literacy. Okay, secondary report cards. Secondary report cards are the report cards that probably all of us remember getting, A's through F's, and all of the subjects, 1 grade per subject, broken down into however the district organizes its year, semesters, marking periods, trimesters, whatever it is. And then usually they are all cohorted together, and then there's a final block for a final grade. Occasionally, depending on the size of the school, you may have teacher comments. They are typically not written out in script. It's usually a numerical code. Every district is different. In the district that I'm most familiar with, I used to say 1s are bad. You know, if it's a 1, those are all associated with the negative behaviors. 3s are good. But if the district operates using a numerical code for things like turning in homework, performance on tests and quizzes, kind of what Katie was talking about, the how is this individual performing in the community. If they're using a numerical code, the report card somewhere should have a little index, and you'll be able to see is the 1 the good, and they'll break down all of the behaviors in the 1s, in the 1 column, the 2 column, and the 3 column. Things like, and this becomes critical at middle and high school, things like how well does the student manage their day? How well does a student manage multiple demands from multiple teachers? That is typically not going to be explicitly stated on the report card. And this is where, remember how I started with the connection. If a child, for example, has a learning disability or has ADHD, and as a result, there is an IEP in place, things like executive functioning, organizing your day, prioritizing your assignments, understanding how to ask for help, that is likely part of the IEP, or it should be. That will not be necessarily mirrored in the report card, and you might see a grade that's, a C or a D. When you explore what went into that grade, it could very well be because of deficits around the executive functioning, organizational functioning aspect of that child's IEP. So those are ways that you can use the report card, and those are gaps that the report card may not have, but that you would find in IEP progress monitoring. Another important, really important component of a secondary level, high school level student's program, a child with an IEP, is transition. How are they getting prepared for life after high school? Very little is going to be said about that in a report card. You're going to have to lean into the IEP progress monitoring for that type of information.
And I would just add on that something I always look at on the IEP progress monitoring is not just the kind of like drop down box, making sufficient progress, not making sufficient progress, you know, nearing mastery. I do like to look at whatever narrative or data they give, because sometimes I look at the data and I say, I don't think this is making sufficient progress. And so I would really just, I know it can be overwhelming, but I would look at the latest marking periods comments on the IEP progress report as well, progress monitoring. So another piece of information that will be on virtually every school district or charter schools report card is the student's attendance. And you don't have to count every single day, but take a look at that number and make sure it seems accurate to you. If it seems really high, you definitely want to follow up, because after missing a certain number of days, it can implicate truancy. And it can matter, especially for a student with an IEP, in measuring progress and in assessing factors that may be leading to problems with progress. If a student is being marked absent and they're not in fact absent, that is going to play into your discussion in a way that will take away from what the true issue could be. So one thing to be on the lookout for is schools where kids have to actually badge or swipe in with an ID. If there are technology glitches, or if your student isn't understanding that process, they may be marked absent when they're not. And understanding the cause of that problem will help you to address it. If it is, in fact, a learning deficit on the part of your student, they don't understand the importance of it, they don't understand how to do it, that is something that the IEP team can address, because that's an important part of life, right? They might have a job at some point where they have to clock in or badge in or report to someone that they're there. So understanding the importance of actually like logging your attendance can be a good transition skill. I also see a lot of times students bringing notes to school from their parents that are not turned in. If possible, it's better to email them, because then you have the record trail of it and you're not relying on a child, maybe a child with organizational difficulties or executive functioning difficulties, to turn in the note. And if you already sent notes with your student and you don't think that they were received, go back and send them again by email if possible. The other thing to keep in mind is if your student did miss a lot of school and it was for a medical reason, we really recommend that you make that medical condition known to the school. You don't have to provide every single doctor's record. You don't have to provide, you know, all of your medical records, but making a school aware of a medical condition that will impact attendance can have important IEP implications. If the student is going to miss a lot of school because of a medical condition, they may be entitled to services outside of the school day, in the home, or even in a hospital if they're hospitalized, to make sure that they are keeping up as well as possible in light of their medical needs, so that they're not falling too far behind and they're still making appropriate educational progress.
So we're going to move on to conferences. You've gotten a piece of paper or you've logged in through your school's parent portal and you've seen the report card. What happens next, or should be happening around the same time, is the parent-teacher conference. A parent-teacher conference is one conversation. It's going to be brief. This is not, you come into the conference room and there are lots of people. It is not your IEP meeting, but it can be an important stepping stone to very much what you might want to do next, which is have a follow-up IEP meeting. Parent-teacher conferences are important. You don't know what you don't know. Certain kids come home I don't know these children. I raised 2 kids. They never told me what was going on in school. How is school? Fine. What did you do in school today? Nothing. Well, I know that's not true. They didn't do nothing. They did something. But this is your opportunity with, at least at the elementary level, most kids have a single teacher, to sit with that teacher and get his or her input in terms of how your child is doing. As kids get older, you know, that little nurturing environment of one teacher starts to grow, and kids have multiple teachers. So we're going to talk a little bit about how do you get the most out of a parent-teacher conference, particularly when a child may have multiple teachers as they are moving on through the grades.
And that's actually a great segue to this next slide, which is about who is going to attend the conference. So in elementary school, that will typically be your child's teacher. And a lot of times they'll only have one teacher. You may still want to consider, if there is an aide in the classroom, whether you want to ask that that person be available too, especially if that person is providing a lot of support to your child. And if your child is having any difficulties in any of their specials classes, you can certainly reach out and ask for conferences with those teachers as well. However, most of the elementary school conferences are going to be with their primary teacher, their classroom teacher. In secondary school, you may have a choice of who you meet with, and you may have limited time. It's, you know, not everyone is able to take the time off work or take the time from their other family obligations to meet with every single teacher. So in secondary school, in middle and high school, it's important to consider which teachers you want to meet with when there are multiple options. Definitely consider the classes where your child is struggling. It's helpful to understand what your child is doing well, but this is a time to jump on top of any issues that your child is having. And hopefully you've received the report card before the parent-teacher conferences, and so you can identify which classes are a concern and meet with those teachers. In addition to the reading, writing, arithmetic, sometimes we'll think of the 4 core classes: ELA, math, science, and social studies. Consider any specials teachers, but also any related service providers. If your student has an IEP and is receiving speech language pathology, occupational therapy, counseling services, school psychological services, consider asking for a conference with those individuals. They are very likely providing services to your student in a much smaller environment, or may have a very different perspective on what is working for your child and what needs tweaking. We also note on here to consider asking for the PCA to be present in a conference. That's the personal aide to your student. If your student has one, they don't assume that they are going to be in the conference. So if you want to meet with them as well, ask that you get a conference with them, either with the teacher or one-on-one. As Kim already mentioned, it's not an IEP meeting, so not everyone will be there, but you may want to follow up for an IEP meeting, and we'll talk about that as we get into next steps. And finally, I always, I think we are reluctant to jump in and interrupt, but keep in mind that teachers will typically have some remarks prepared for every student, because some parents come in unprepared and the teacher wants to be able to speak to them. If you have questions, don't feel bad about jumping in with your questions. You can do it in a polite way, but you're there to get the information. The teacher will probably have some info prepared, and it is perfectly okay to jump in and ask your questions. And I say that also as a former teacher. I was always happy to hear from parents what their questions were, because then I could actually address what they really wanted to know.
Make sure you know and have an understanding of the basics, the logistics. How is this meeting going to unfold? With COVID, everyone has gotten used to doing what we're doing tonight, which is you log into a Zoom, you log into a Google Meet, you log into a Team. What is that going to look like for your parent-teacher conference? Sometimes, parent-teacher conferences and after-school or a parent night. See, it's been a while for me. They're in the evenings. Maybe if you are open to having a virtual conference, that could be something that more people could participate in. To Katie's point, maybe that's the way you get this. Thanks, Katie.
No
So
problem.
why she's pulling that up, it's wonderful to hear great things about your child. I get that. But understand, you want to be prepared to go in with a mission. Reading, writing, or an arithmetic. Here are some realities. Every single district, whether you're in upstate Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh, southeastern Pennsylvania, in Chester, or over in Delaware, where Katie practices. Every district does benchmarking. Benchmarking happens for every child, whether a child has an IEP or not. When a child is benchmarked, they are benchmarked 3 times a year in reading and math. You should be asking at your parent-teacher conference, whether that's the beginning of the year, the middle of the year, or the end of the year, you should be asking for the most recent benchmarking scores. Words to listen for that maybe you want to push on a little bit are words like, your child is keeping up, your child is doing fine, your child is right in the middle of the pack in terms of the rest of the class. Those are words, but they are not data. That does not really inform you in a way, because remember what Katie said about those report cards. Those report cards are measuring skills in a very objective way. Has the skill been mastered? A benchmark score will tell you that. Is the child still progressing with the skill? The benchmark will tell you that. Does the child have no understanding of the skill? The benchmark score will tell you that. So make sure to ask for those scores, whether it is in reading or in math. They don't benchmark for things like social studies and science. Another helpful, I call them artifacts. It's like being an archaeologist in your kids' education. Another good artifact to ask for is a work folder. And I would think, now, Katie, when you were a teacher, I bet you brought those to parent-teacher conferences. You had
Often.
a couple examples of a child's work. You want to really look at your child's writing, particularly kids with disabilities, learning disabilities, and even ADHD and other health impairment. You can see oftentimes the impact that disability is having in how a child writes. Not just are they staying in the lines and are they making the letters in the correct way, but how they are actually organizing a sentence, or how they are organizing a 3 to 5 sentence little story. So ask to see an example of that writing. You want to, for a high school student, a parent-teacher conference is a good time to talk about what is a plan for graduation. You're going to talk about that in great detail in an IEP meeting, but at the conference, you can get input from a teacher in terms of how is this high schooler progressing toward the hopeful graduation, the graduation time. You can ask to see curriculum. What happens during reading? What happens during social studies? Ask to see the textbooks. Ask to see the instructional materials. You may find them to be well above what you think your child can actually access. But you may also see that some of them are adapted. I would hope that you would see a mixture of both. But those are things that are in a classroom, typically in a classroom, and should be available for you to take a look at during the conference.
And I just want to go back. I think that I advanced the slides too quickly. Kim, was the slide before this one, I think showed the benchmarks. And I just wanted to go back to that because these are some examples of some of the
Oh my
testing
God.
that
Yeah,
you
I
were talking
completely,
about.
yep,
And
I took over your slide. I'm so
no,
sorry.
no, no.
Why don't you
That
talk
was
about the benchmark tests?
no, that was my fault because I was displaying the slides and got ahead of myself. But I am so glad that you were emphasizing the benchmark testing, and I just wanted to go back to show examples of it. So can you just confirm, am I showing now a slide with the back of a teacher's head and then
Yep.
two people sitting? Okay, so these are some examples of the benchmark tests that you may see, and you might have heard of these tests in your district: Ames Web, STAR testing, MAP testing, iReady. These are not specific to Pennsylvania or specific to Delaware. They are published and made available to schools all over, and your district will have, purchased and decided to use one of those measures, and hopefully they stick with it for a little while so that you can compare over time how your student is doing. But those are some common names of benchmark tests, and they are typically administered in the beginning of the year, the middle of the year, and the end of the year. And in addition to asking at the conference for the data from the most recent benchmark testing, you can ask to see the benchmark data over time. And that I find to be really helpful in making sure that your child is making progress, because even if they are at an appropriate level for their grade, you also want to look and make sure that they're making progress appropriate for them. And if they have not actually progressed, they may actually have an area of strength in a subject, and they are bored in that class and are not learning enough. And that's something important to look at too. Just as much as where kids are struggling, it's important to know where they need enrichment. So we'll pop over that slide.
Hop over that one. Okay. So what can you share? And Katie talked about the very first one, medical issues. Again, as she explained, you do not have to go in to the full story, but it's important that a teacher know, even if it's not something super serious, but for the last 2 weeks, everyone in our house has struggled with COVID, or even maybe your family includes an older relative and maybe they've been hospitalized, for example. That can absolutely have an impact on kids. So things that are going on, major updates in a child's life, whether it's specific to the individual child, within the immediate family, or sometimes the extended family. Mom or dad lost a job. That can create some stress in the house. Things like this are good for a teacher to know, and it's certainly information we would counsel sharing in the context of a conference. Outside evaluations. So many families that we partner with are working not just hard to advocate in the educational space, but they are also working hard in the medical space and in the behavioral health space to get their child services and supports that are important. The question many parents have is, should I be sharing these evaluations? And as a general rule, but I have a caveat to it. As a general rule, we always say share, because these are evaluations that are insights into a child from a professional that may outline supports and services that child needs. What's my caveat? I review evaluations for parents in advance of them sharing with districts, because particularly mental health evaluation reports are very confidential. And they can contain, as they should, a lot of information about other family members, a lot of highly sensitive information that really isn't necessary for a school to know. And so I will take a black marker and redact, it's blacking out, blocking from view, that type of personal information. At a minimum, a school should know a child's current diagnosis, or if there are multiple diagnoses, what those diagnoses are, and any school-based recommendations. So that's medical is the same thing in terms of the confidentiality. I will also say in Pennsylvania, kids 14 and older have the right to say they do not want mental health information shared. So when we get into the middle and high school age conversation around evaluations, I will always tell parents, we need to bring the child into this conversation because they have rights under the Mental Health Act in terms of who can see this information. Something else to share at conferences is homework struggles. So when I was raising kids, there was a rule of thumb about how much homework a child should have. What is the duration of homework for a first grader, second grader, third grader? And every district was different, and I suspect that that is still the case. But you need to understand what the expectation is. And in my time, that expectation was always followed by, and 30 minutes of reading, because early literacy is so important. But the reason you need to know what is the teacher's expectation in terms of how much time to dedicate to homework is because when that clock goes off, homework needs to stop. This is particularly important for kids with an IEP. Today, I was on the phone for at least three different parents talking to me about their children spending 2 and 3 hours doing homework and how this was causing great upset. Of course it was. How it was exhausting. Of course it was. It should never be that. Homework is homework. It is not replicating school. It is not the time for the child to learn the material. I will often tell parents when that clock goes off, if it's 20 minutes for a second grader, at 20 minutes you stop, you write a note on top of the homework page. If not all the problems are done, we stopped at 20 minutes. This is the work shown is what my child was able to do. Around work shown, do not do your child's homework for them. Don't do it. Just don't do it. The reason you don't do it is because it sends a false message. It sends the message that this material has been mastered. And this always comes out. It always comes out because there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect between a child who's doing the homework and doing it beautifully, and then testing quiz scores or benchmark scores. So I know it might be tempting. Oh, look at that sentence. It's so sloppy. Erase, erase, erase. Let the sentence sit. The teacher needs to know and needs to see how this child is performing outside of the learning environment, outside of the school setting. But you need to be writing the notes on the actual homework when it goes back in, and at the parent-teacher conference, you need to be sharing with the teacher what those struggles are and what they look like. I said this a little bit in the beginning about major updates in a child's life. There's an actual acronym. It's called an ACE, and that stands for Adverse Child Experiences. There's a lot of research. It existed prior to COVID, and it's only gotten larger in scope as a result of COVID in terms of trauma for kids. Trauma for kids looks like you would expect in many ways, death in the family, violence in the community, But it also encompasses things like divorce. It encompasses things like incarceration. It encompasses things like separation, extended separations between caregivers and kids. So things like, you can Google it, ACEs, ACE, in children. Take a look at that. And if your child is going through something like that, is having that type of experience, that is something to certainly share in a conference.
And I'll add one more adverse child experience, which is experiencing homelessness or home insecurity. And that does not just look like being on the street. If you are staying with friends, if you have unstable housing, that that can be difficult to share with the school, but it can be important because it can impact the child's progress, but also because there are laws that can help you keep your child in the school that they are in, even if you are moving around and crossing district lines. And that stability can be really helpful in those circumstances.
Absolutely. Oh, I can't move it. Oh, there you go.
I moved it. I think
All
I
right.
did.
I was quick.
And then, we wanted to have a note about low incidence disabilities. So these are disabilities that are more rare. Deaf blindness, hearing impairment, blindness or vision impairment, students with significant intellectual disabilities, disabilities that affect a much lower percentage of the population. It's important to think of a lot of different considerations, but two that we wanted to highlight are extended eligibility. So being able to stay in school past their quote senior year until they are 20, 21 or 22, depending on the state. And thinking about an intentional plan for that extended eligibility. And that ties in with transition planning. So, Kim talked earlier tonight about the transition plan, looking at your students' progress toward being more independent. And that's true no matter what your child's post-secondary plan is going to look like. You want to make sure that you are understanding what the district or charter school is doing to move your child along that path, and ask questions about it at the conference. So if one of your child's goals is to be able to grocery shop on their own, then you want to follow up on that and say, okay, how are they doing with making a grocery list? Are you having to help prompt them, or are they writing it themselves? Can they look at a recipe and write down the things? Have you guys gone to the grocery store? And is somebody actually walking through the grocery store with my child? Or are they navigating the aisles on their own and somebody's kind of standing back watching them? You can get that granular. And in fact, I would encourage you to, because that's going to be helpful in knowing what additional steps need to happen to prepare your child for post-secondary. And then our last slide here is a thank you for attending, but I did want to just take this, this as a benchmark to talk about next steps. Because we had alluded to them, and I wanted to just kind of circle back. One thing that Kim had mentioned was asking for an IEP meeting. So if you leave the conferences with more questions, if you come out and you're saying, I still don't understand the data, I still don't understand my child's progress. Or if you leave the conference and you don't feel confident that there are changes that are going to be made that will help your child change direction in ways that they need to, or if those changes are significant enough that they should be documented in the IEP, then you want to ask for an IEP meeting. You want to get that whole group together because, as we've talked about it again and again, a conference is usually just you and one other person, maybe the PCA in addition to a teacher. So having an IEP meeting to get everyone together is important. And one of the reasons it's important is to document any changes that will be made. Even if the teacher says, oh, we're going to do all these fabulous things to turn things around, you want to make sure that that's documented somewhere so that if something, God forbid, happens to the teacher, or if they just forget, you can follow up on it and say, hey, remember how we were going to implement a different reading curriculum? And it's in the IEP. So we got to make sure that that's happening.
I would also add, remember the disconnect. In a
Mhm.
perfect world, all the puzzle pieces fit together all the time. Katie and I would not have jobs if all of the pieces fit together all of the time. And they very rarely do. It's a complicated process. Helping kids to learn, whether they're typical or not typical, is complicated. So the puzzle pieces are not always going to fit. Your parent-teacher conference, you now have some information about things you can ask and things you can see. Maybe you're going in with a little bit of a feeling of a disconnect, but in that conference, you're feeling like the puzzle pieces are okay. That's great. If, however, you leave that conference, and as Katie said, you've got more questions now than you did before, IEP meeting. If you leave that conference and the puzzle pieces are not fitting, it's a disconnect, IEP meeting. If you leave that conference and it's been beautiful, you went in with questions and the teacher said, we're going to change the curriculum. We're going to have a smaller reading group. We're going to have more reading time. I'm going to give some extra writing practice. You absolutely have to have an IEP meeting, because that means your child's day is going to look different. So you want to make sure that everybody's on the same page with this great plan that came out of a parent-teacher conference. And I would just close by saying, you get one parent-teacher conference, 2, 3 a year, you get some report cards. Always remember, you can have as many IEP meetings as you need. Do not wait. So do not feel constrained by your dates, meaning, let's say tomorrow or the end of this week, you go to a parent-teacher conference, but your child's IEP, annual IEP, isn't due until March. Don't wait until March to carry all of this information from the parent-teacher conference into the then IEP meeting. That's months and months and months away. Always remember, as a parent of a child with an IEP, when you are feeling a disconnect, you can ask for an IEP meeting at any time. And I would say, always know that Katie, myself, our entire firm is here to help. I have learned over the years that there is no instinct stronger than a parent's instinct. If you are feeling that there is a disconnect and you have done your best to fix it, do not labor alone. If you've done your best to fix it and it is still not working for your child, reach out to our firm. We have an intake line that you can use. There is no cost for a consultation with one of our attorneys. We are here to help you through this journey and in this process.
And that's a good time for me to put up our contact information.
There you go.